Welcome, everyone. This is the Liberty Classroom course, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I'm your instructor, Robert Murphy, and we're now on Lecture 10, David Ricardo. Oh, my goodness, folks, we have so much information to pack into this lecture. I hope you're ready. Listen quickly because I'm going to move fast. Here's the outline of what we're going to cover for those of you who are watching along with the PowerPoint. David Ricardo, 1772 to 1823. Let me just note, remember, folks, the Wealth of Nations was published in 1776. And so Ricardo here, 1772, his birth. He did not read the Wealth of Nations when he was 4 years old. He was a precocious, intelligent lad, but not that much. And but I just want to point that out to you. So when you're thinking of these figures and their relationship to each other, as we'll see, David Ricardo was going to go down in history as one of the classical figures in what we now call classical economics, or more specifically British classical economics. And again, just pointing out, he was only 4 years old when the Wealth of Nations was first published. Okay, the biography of Ricardo. So he was born in London and began working for his father at the stock exchange at age 14. He went on to become extremely successful. In fact, he's been called the richest economist who ever lived, once you adjust for the purchasing power of money, of course. Some people point out that, oh, wow, Keynes was a really successful investor, and you know, there's controversies about that. But regardless, Ricardo was far richer than Keynes. Now, to be fair, I'm still in the running. I haven't died yet, but at this point, I have yet to prove myself to be a better speculator than Ricardo. So he retired in 1814. At that point, he was 42 years old. He bought an estate and just went to there and turned to literary pursuits. And remember, he had a great friendship with James Mill, who, and Ricardo, with his great wealth, you know, sort of supported Mill at certain points. Major works, Essay on the Influence of a Low Price of Corn on the Profits of Stock, that came out in 1815. And then 2 years later, his Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about the historical placement of Ricardo. So in other words, in the history of economic thought, where do we place David Ricardo, and how does he relate to the people that came before and then the people that are going to come later? So first of all, what you need to understand is put his work in the context of geopolitical history, so in particular the Napoleonic Wars. So those were from 1803 to 1815, and they had cut off corn from abroad and led to rising prices. All right, so Great Britain and France are at war with each other, and because of that, you know, being an island, the British were surrounded, and it was hard to bring in food from abroad. All right, so naturally, because of the wartime shortage, what's that going to do domestically? It's going to lead to rising food prices, and they're also going to bring more land into cultivation. So, flip it now. The end of the war is in sight, and British landowners are now saying, whoa, 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 once we resume peaceful relations and we have corn coming back in, you know, isn't that going to be a problem? So, of course, what they were concerned about, it was going to crash the price of corn, and then their rental income was going to go down. But they didn't just couch it in such a self-serving way. So let me read to you from, well, let me first mention, though, so what they wanted to do is they wanted the government to maybe put up domestic barriers, you know, so that the British government would be preventing just the free flow of corn because the war ended. And so I'm pointing out here if you're watching on the PowerPoints, I say Henry George. Why am I saying that? Because this was Henry George's point. I don't know if he had this episode in mind or was just speaking more generally, but Henry George, one of his best one-liners against protectionism, against putting up tariffs to allegedly promote industry in your own country, and I'm paraphrasing, but Henry George said that during peacetime, the proponents of protectionism seek to do to our country what our enemies seek to do us during wartime. And so here, this is literally true, that you would think people would say, oh, okay, so during the war, part of the problem was we couldn't just bring in food the way we normally did because of, the naval battles and whatnot. And so that's a bad thing, right? And so why would we then, when the war is about to end, have our government keep that system in force and not let corn from abroad come in, right? If that's a bad thing that happens during war and the enemies try to blockade you during war and not let food get in, that's a tactic of the enemy to hurt you. How in the world can it be a good thing that we do it to ourselves via our own government when there's peace? Okay, now I've got a note to myself here to read from Lionel Robbins' description. So again, for this course, I rely on a few secondary sources of famous historians of economic thought, Lionel Robbins being one of them. So here I am reading from his discussion when he's setting the backdrop to David Ricardo coming on the scene. So the Napoleonic Wars are wrapping up. So Robbins says, and this is a lecture that Robbins is giving. It's not formal writing. He says, well, the agricultural community viewed this prospective end of the war with apprehension. They were in a panic lest the cessation of the mutual blockade should mean that the high prices were brought down by imports from, let us say, Poland and elsewhere. Poland was a great source of wheat in those days. It was argued by the agricultural interests, the agriculturists, the landowners and farmers, and possibly anyone who was articulate on behalf of the agricultural laborers, that it was in the interest of the nation to keep prices high. If it was not done, then corn land would go out of cultivation, and there would be in the end a greater shortage of corn than ever before. And so committees of both houses of Parliament were appointed, and they collected evidence which went to show that the lands recently taken into cultivation were more expensive to cultivate, and therefore that if prices fell, they would go over to grass again. All right, so I don't know if you caught that, but just how specious that argument was. The landowners and their hired guns or whatever, and the people who might have been speaking on behalf of the workers that worked those farms, they were saying to Parliament, you have to put up barriers to keep cheap foreign corn out, otherwise the total amount of corn available to our people might shrink, which is crazy. Okay, but that's what they were arguing, because they couldn't just argue, oh, wait a minute, I wouldn't like it if the price of corn falls. I kind of like the fact that during the war and the blockade, the value of my real estate went up because we couldn't get cheap foreign imported corn. They can't say that. So instead they're trying to argue, oh, you got to keep out cheap foreign corn to make sure we have enough corn. That doesn't make any sense, but that's what they were arguing. Also, let me mention, when you read discussions of the classical economists and their models of the economy, you will often hear people talk about corn and wheat and so on. You're like, wait a minute, what is it? What are we talking about? Which crop? And here, Lionel Robbins, earlier in this lecture, he had this sort of throwaway line. He says, but the shutting off of imports of corn by the war played its part, and as a result of the high prices of corn, and then he's got like a dash, I use the word corn in its generic sense to cover wheat and rye and oats and so on, and then he goes back to his discussion. All right, so I'm just pointing out, don't get all hyped up when you read about the classical economists and their models of the economy if people sometimes use the word corn or sometimes say wheat or sometimes say food. It's not that the model is real sophisticated and it has that many different goods in it. It's a generic term. There's only one good. Okay, let's maybe talk a little bit about just classical economics as a whole. So, aided by James Mill, who again was sort of like his coach, cheerleader, tutor in many respects, someone he bounced ideas off of, Ricardo became the leader of a group of economists. I mean, you might call it a school, but certainly he was a very powerful figure. And then later on, I think it's safe to say that the Principles book that Ricardo would write, and then later the Principles book that John Stuart Mill would write, those two together, I think if you had to pick two works to say, hey, what epitomizes British classical economics? You know, if I just wanted to read two books so that I would be up to speed on what are you talking about when you talk about the classical tradition, certainly the classical tradition in the English language, what should I read? I think those two books you'd be on solid ground. All right, let me now fast forward. Well, just a little bit, and then we'll fast forward even more. Again, I'm still talking about understanding the Ricardian system and its relationship to the rest of economic thought. So this may surprise you if you've never studied this before, but Karl Marx is arguably a classical economist himself. So when we talk about these groupings, we're not simply saying, oh, who has policy recommendations that I like? So you might think, oh, Karl Marx, there's no way we got to put him in the same category as Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill. Well, Mill also was a socialist and later, but there's no way you might think there's no way we would put Marx in the same category as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. I mean, those guys were not perfect libertarians, but they were really big on capitalism and the free market, weren't they? And Marx was, well, he was Karl Marx. The issue is the economic analysis. All right, it's not a throwaway line when we say economic analysis is scientific and value neutral. All right, and so there is a sense in which Karl Marx is a classical economist, and in particular, he drew heavily on the models and the framework that Ricardo developed. So there's the labor theory of value, number one, which was, you could see that in Smith, but Ricardo also had some version of what we now call the iron law of wages, meaning that the workers' wages just get pushed down through the Malthusian mechanism to the point at which the workers just earn enough to subsist. They earn a subsistence wage. All right, so you can see why that would fit into the Marxist framework. An ever-shrinking rate of profit. At the end of this lecture, where I'm going to go over the mechanism by which that was supposed to happen in the Ricardian system. So in other words, over time, the capitalists kept getting squeezed more and more if you just had a static system. And that was why now in the Marxist system, taking that notion of a diminishing amount of profits over time, Marx thought this is why the capitalists are such imperialists. You know, they have to expand to get foreign markets, because if you just hold fixed the domestic market, or even if they have foreign markets but keep it fixed, then the Ricardian logic kicks in, and over time the capitalists get squeezed tighter and tighter. And so for them to survive, they're going to have to convince their governments to go invade new places, right? So again, the Ricardian system that I'm going to describe to you by the end of this lecture, Marx would take that and he would heap praise on it too, right? So Marx acknowledged the fact that, yes, I'm indebted to David Ricardo for him developing this stuff, and I'm just taking it further. Okay, but also in the 20th century, there was a resurgence in interest in Ricardo, because what happened was there was this Italian economist, Piero Sraffa, and in 1960, he wrote what would come to be a very influential in certain circles book called The Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. I will include that in the syllabus. You know, it's completely optional. Obviously, you don't have to read something that came out in 1960 in terms of your understanding of David Ricardo. I'm not going to include Sraffa himself. I'm going to include a critique that I wrote for the Mises Institute website. And the point is going to be that if you see the Sraffian system develops, it's very similar in structure to the Ricardian approach. It's just more mathematical. And so that will shed light on what's distinct about Ricardo. And the reason this is interesting, or the part of the reason I want to do that for you guys, is it's kind of confusing that we're here talking about classical economists or classical economics, and I just told you that the work of Ricardo epitomizes British classical economics. Now, when we get to the 20th century, if you stick with this course and the next one, part 2 of the history of economic thought that I'm doing here for Liberty Classroom, you're going to see that eventually there's going to be this new tradition, and it's going to be called the neoclassical approach. You may have heard Austrian economists in our time referring, they might say the mainstream, or they might say more specifically the neoclassical mainstream, to distinguish the Austrian school from maybe what you're going to learn. I mean, that's what I learned at NYU, or if you go to some of the other, top-ranked schools in economics, what you're going to be learning is standard it's going to be called neoclassical theory. So Schraffa in 1960 was recoiling against neoclassical theory. People like Joan Robinson, they don't like the neoclassicals. Neoclassicals being people like Paul Samuelson. And so you might be saying, well, I don't like Paul Samuelson either. Tell me more. Okay, so I'm just pointing out in terms of the labeling, it's a bit weird because the Schraffians ended up being called the Neo-Ricardians. So it was the Neo-Ricardians were doing battle with the neoclassicals, but wait a minute, David Ricardo was a classical, so that sounds like it makes no sense. All right, so it'd be like the followers of Bill Murray fighting the followers of people who love Caddyshack. He's like, I don't get that. Doesn't make any sense. Well, the explanation is that when the Schraffians called themselves Neo-Ricardians, they didn't just mean the whole classical tradition. They meant specifically the way that Ricardo would come up with just some key relationships and then try to deduce mechanically the returns to various factors of production. All right, so that's why I'm going to include in this syllabus, or the syllabus for this topic, this lecture that we're doing now on David Ricardo. I will include a link to my essay where I critique Schraffa's approach, because you'll see what I mean more specifically. Let me read to you from Mark Blogg's discussion of Ricardo. So I'll let him put it in his words. So here, this is about a page of his writing, but I just want you to understand this. So Blogg had first said how Ricardo was big in his day, but then, especially with the marginal revolution in the 1870s, the Ricardian system had fallen into disrepute, and his day in the sun was over. But then Blogg says, Ricardo has staged a comeback, however, in our own times. One of the many features of Ricardo's thinking that had puzzled generations of readers was his habit of expressing all his economic variables in terms of an invariable measure of value, a hypothetical yardstick which even he admitted did not and could not exist as such. But in 1960, Piero Schraffa published a slim volume entitled The Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, which purported to show that Ricardo had been right all along to measure prices with the aid of a yardstick that makes relative prices invariant to changes in profits and wages. This appeared to rehabilitate Ricardo as having put his finger on a vital truth. It is possible, contrary to modern teaching, to divorce the determination of commodity prices from the determination of factor prices, and there is even a sense in which it may be said that, logically, the latter precedes the former. Coming from an author, he's now talking about Schraffa, who was himself the editor of the works and correspondence of David Ricardo, Schraffa's reinterpretation of Ricardo could not be ignored. It took little time for Marxist economists to perceive the significance of this Schraffian reading of Ricardo. The history of economic thought, they say, reveals two great branches, a general equilibrium branch leading down from Jevons, Walras, and even Marshall to the Samuelsons and Friedmans of today, in which all relevant economic variables are mutually and simultaneously determined. So that's the one branch, the general equilibrium branch. And, so now the other branch, and a Ricardo, Marx, Schraffa branch, in which distribution takes priority over pricing, and in which all economic variables are causally determined in a sequential chain, starting from the real wage and hence the power relationships between capital and labor. Thus, 160 years after his death, Ricardo, that most bourgeois of all bourgeois economists, is back in business as one of the founding fathers of Marxian economics. Such are the strange twists and turns of intellectual history. Okay, so again, that was from page 200 of Mark Blogg's book, Great Economists Before Keynes. All right, so that may have been a lot for some of you to process, but what that was getting at is, and the reason I spent so much time reading such a long excerpt, I want you to understand there's different ways of modeling the economy. And so there, Blog was saying that today's Marxist, or when he published his book, which wasn't that long ago, the Marxists recognize that, okay, there's different approaches that Ricardo and then Marx and then Schraffa were not engaging in what we as Austrian, I'm assuming most of you listening are Austrian economists or fans of the Austrian school, view as the great revolution, the marginal revolution of the 1870s. And so that's partly the way, or one way of understanding the distinction in the approach, or the difference in the approaches, is that in the 1870s, they started looking at marginal productivity and looking at individual units, and then that's how you would determine price relationships. And the prices of the finished goods would then move up the chain, so that you would figure out the factor prices that way. And then these considerations of marginal utility and marginal productivity would then pin down what the equilibrium real wage had to be, or the equilibrium real interest rate, or the equilibrium rental rate of a piece of land. And then once you had those prices, those relative prices pinned down, then you'd say, oh, and then now we can figure out how much do workers get, what's their standard of living, or how much of total output is then going to end up going to workers, and how much is then going to end up going to the capitalists, and how much is going to go to the landowners. Whereas the Ricardian approach kind of did it the other way around. They didn't worry about like the determination, like they didn't look at factors that determined relative prices, like, gee, how much does an apple get in the market compared to a horse or something, or an hour of a horse's effort. Instead, they just looked at the broad classifications, like this is the total output, and then how much of it's going to go to this class and this class and this class. And so you'll see, if you're curious, that's why I want to include my critique of Schraffa, because you'll see with numerical examples how Schraffa took that and modernized it. And the difference between what Blog is calling the general equilibrium approach with marginal factor pricing versus the sort of macro distribution class approach that Ricardo inaugurated, the difference will jump out at you. Also, let me just say, and I got to move on because we're running out of time here, that tradition that Blog mentions, notice you didn't see any Austrian economists in there. And so Israel Kirzner had an essay where he was trying to show that this dispute between the neo-Ricardians and the neoclassicals was leaving out the Austrian school, and the Austrian school managed to avoid the errors of both camps. Okay, let me now come back to something we've mentioned before, comparative advantage. So if you ask the average professional economist, hey, what was Ricardo's contribution to economic thought? He or she would probably say, comparative advantage, right? Or actually, more realistically, he or she would probably say, who's Ricardo? I've never heard of that. I don't read anything that was published after before 1990. Okay, comparative advantage. Now, I have in the course notes for this lecture an exhaustive discussion of this. And so I'm going to urge you to go look at that. You will understand the case for free trade much better than you ever have if you read those course notes that I put for this particular lecture. So even if you haven't been reading those up till now and you're never going to read them again, I want you to read these ones because I walk you through comparative advantage. So here, if you're watching the PowerPoint, let me just explain this table. I'm not going to give the whole full-blown case for free trade right now. It's just not worth the use of time it would require. And also because you've heard me say it verbally in previous lectures. I'm sure you've heard plenty of other people say it. And so at this point, the only way your understanding is going to be deeper is if you work through a numerical example, and that's the kind of thing where you need to be reading it. So that's why I'm really urging you to read my notes for this particular lecture. You should do it for all the lectures, but this one in particular. Okay, so this table, though, let me just make sure you understand how to read it and what this table is saying, and then you're in good shape for me to turn you loose onto the course notes. So the table shows two countries, United States and Mexico, and then it shows the number of worker hours to make either a TV or a jet engine. So in the United States, for example, it takes 1 worker hour to make 1 television set. It takes 5 worker hours to make 1 jet engine. In Mexico, in contrast, it takes 2 worker hours to make a TV, but it takes 20 worker hours to make a jet engine. So the idea here is, in terms of worker productivity, with these numbers that I picked up, obviously for convenience, the U.S. workers are better at both TV production and jet engine production. So using Adam Smith's framework, where he made his case for free trade largely one of absolute advantage, you would not be able to demonstrate to a critic that it would make sense for, with these numerical, with this, these numbers I've picked, you wouldn't be able to make the case that the U.S. should have free trade with Mexico, because it's not obvious. Why would the U.S. benefit? Because the Mexican workers are worse at both TV and jet engine production. So how do we benefit from specializing in one thing and shipping it to them? Well, the answer is we still benefit because we have a comparative advantage in jet engine production. So there's different ways you could see this with these particular numbers. You could say that for every 2 hours of labor, the U.S. It makes twice as many television sets, right? That since it takes 1 worker hour to make a TV in the U.S., after 2 hours they will have 2 TVs, whereas in Mexico it takes 2 worker hours to make a TV, so after 2 hours they'll just have 1. All right, so the U.S. makes twice as many TVs for a given amount of man hours as Mexico does. All right, but it makes 4 times as many jet engines as the Mexican workers do for a given input of man hours from each country. All right, so the advantage, the superiority of the United States in jet engines is even higher than it is in TV production. And so that's why, if you first start out with a state of autarky where the U.S. just produces TVs and jet engines domestically for its own people, and Mexico does the same, and you look and you see what's the standard of living in those 2 countries, then you open up trade and allow the Mexicans to specialize in TV production and the U.S. workers to specialize in jet production or jet engine production, and then you let them trade. And I will show you, if you go through the handout or the notes I'm including, I'll show you how, compared to the original distribution, after you allow for specialization and trade, everybody has more of both things, right? So per capita, the U.S. now has more TVs and more jet engines, and the same is true of the Mexicans. And so that should blow up the idea. If for some reason the way you're thinking of international trade is it can only make a richer country worse off if it mixes its economy with a poorer country, I picked the numbers on purpose to show you that can't be true in general. Your logic is wrong if you think that that's a general rule, that when a rich country trades with a poor country, their economies kind of meet halfway or something. That logic is totally, totally wrong. So that's why the point of going through these sort of simplistic examples, yeah, it's true in the real world. There's 19,000 other things going on in addition to the fact that there's more than 2 goods. But the point of these real simplistic examples is to make sure you see the principle of the comparative advantage and how it works in a real simple thought experiment, and then that will make sure you don't commit some silly blunder in your reasoning when you try to then figure out, okay, what's true in the real world. All right, so there's a lot of other stuff going on. Somebody could be fully cognizant of the case, the Ricardian case for comparative advantage and free trade, and then still object to it. Paul Craig Roberts, for example, a trained economist, sharp guy, very good in terms of free market principles and politically savvy. He famously, several years ago, renounced his belief in free trade and said that, the Ricardian assumptions are not true anymore in our time. All right, so I'm not telling you this is all you need to know, but I'm saying make sure you really understand the Ricardian point, because it's incredibly powerful and it's counterintuitive. And until you work through an actual numerical example, I'm guessing you won't really see it. And when you work through the example, you say, oh, wow, that's really cool. Okay, let's move on. Ricardo's engine. So here I'm going to read Joseph Schumpeter on the contribution that Ricardo made. So the engine refers to the fact that Ricardo put together a system. Okay, so here is Schumpeter from his discussion of Ricardo. He says, economic theory is not a stock of political recipes, but, to use Mrs. Joan Robinson's felicitous phrase, a box of analytic tools. And these tools are not a heap of disconnected elements, but form an engine. This engine grinds out results within wide limits, no matter what the concrete problem is that is fed into it. It works the same way formally, whether the problem is the effect of a tax or of a wage policy or of a piece of regulation or of protection and whatnot. Hence, the engine within those limits may be constructed once for all to stand ready for use whenever needed for an indefinite variety of purposes. This has always been felt instinctively. Cantillon and the physiocrats brought the idea out into the open, but nobody before Ricardo grasped it as vigorously as he did. In the first 2 chapters of the Principles, he undertook to build such a general-purpose engine. This spelled decisive advance. But of course, if a defective engine meets with success, that advance may easily prove to be a detour. And let me state at once, a detour Ricardian analysis was. Okay, so a few things going on there. Schumpeter is saying that the supreme contribution in terms of the history of economic thought and analysis that Ricardo gave us was he was the first one to build a system that could crank out answers to various types of problems that you fed into it. It wasn't just that he had a very interesting train of thought. Like somebody like David Hume, he had very interesting essays, very eloquent and insightful on particular topics, but it's not like he had this system or this engine of analysis that was a self-contained thing and it was pretty robust and powerful, and you could just throw all sorts of problems at it and crank out the answer. You would have to say, no, what does Hume think about money? Well, let me go look up his essay on money. And then he might have assumptions and so forth and trains of thought to talk about what we now call his price-specie flow mechanism or something. All right, but it's not like Hume had his well-developed theoretical model of the economy that could solve all sorts of problems, whereas that's what Ricardo gave us. So each element in that engine, Schumpeter says, was arguably not something Ricardo had developed. So he wasn't original in terms of any of the components. What he really, the real novelty with Ricardo was he was the one that created a system or an engine far more than any previous economist had done. But then also at the end there, I don't know if you caught that, Schumpeter was saying it was a detour. So it's kind of like he built an engine that was taking us a place we shouldn't have gone. Okay, let me talk about Ricardo's method, and people also talk about the Ricardian vice. Okay, so here I'm just going to read from Rothbard talking about it. So Rothbard says, if wages, profits, and rents exhaust the product, then, tautologically and virtually by definition, if one of the 3 increases and the total is frozen, one or both of the other shares must fall. Hence, the implicit Ricardian assumption of inherent class conflict between the receivers of the 3 blocks of distributive shares. In the Mill-Ricardian system, and there he means James Mill, wages are fixed by the price of corn or the cost of food. The cost of food, for its part, is always increasing because of the fixed supply of land and the alleged Malthusian necessity to move to ever less productive land as the population increases and presses on the food supply. Thus, rents are always slowly but inexorably increasing, and the money wage rates are always rising in order to maintain the real wage at subsistence level. Therefore, hey, presto, aggregate profits must always be falling. Right, so Rothbard's being sarcastic there. He's just basically saying Ricardo assumes all these things, looks at just big macro variables and aggregates and how they relate to each other in very simplistic relationships, and then out pops conclusions as if, there's some profound insight there, when he basically just kind of, put in the assumptions up front and got the conclusions that perhaps he wanted. And then Rothbard says, Schumpeter's blistering critique of the Ricardian system is highly perceptive and perfectly apt. And then now Rothbard's quoting Schumpeter, and this is a different part from the one I just read to you, and it's pretty funny, so let me go ahead and read this. So this is now, again, Schumpeter talking about Ricardo. He cut that general system to pieces, meaning like the economic interdependence of the market, that Ricardo cut that system to pieces bundled up as large parts of it as possible in cold storage so that as many things as possible should be frozen and given. He then piled one simplifying assumption upon another until, having really settled everything by these assumptions, he was left with only a few aggregative variables between which, given these assumptions, he set up simple one-way relations so that, in the end, the desired results emerged almost as tautologies. For example, a famous Ricardian theory is that profits depend upon the price of wheat, and upon his implicit assumptions, and in the particular sense in which the terms of the proposition are to be understood, that is not only true, but undeniably, in fact, trivially so. Profits could not possibly depend upon anything else, since everything else is, quote, given, that is, frozen. It is an excellent theory that can never be refuted and lacks nothing save sense. All right, so I don't know if you got that from me reading it, but that last line, he's saying, the theory is excellent, it can't be refuted, and it lacks nothing except sense, meaning like common sense. All right, so in other words, it's a senseless theory. Okay, so that's what people, when they talk about the Ricardian vice, I think what they may have in mind, or part of it, I just read you some economists talking about it, is the idea of making very simplifying assumptions, and anything you don't want to deal with, you just assume that away, or can just say, let's keep that fixed and take this as a given, and you focus on the stuff you want to focus on, but you end up sort of getting the results you wanted to. So you could prove all sorts of things if you pick the model and your assumptions a certain way. And then so you shouldn't be surprised when, oh, look at this, my model shows me that this thing that I thought was important really is important. Well, yeah, because you held everything else fixed. Okay, let me spend a moment here. I hope, well, I don't hope, but it's easier if you're looking at the PowerPoint for this one. So I have a table, and it says, in the classical framework, and then I've got on the left column the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, and then on the right column, type of income or return, rent, wages, and profit, and then I've got interest in parentheses. Okay, so again, in the classical framework, the discussions are trying to explain in broad terms the income or return to particular factors of production, and actually not necessarily like in terms of their unit price, but sometimes more like, okay, the economy as a whole created this much food in this time period. How much of it is going to go to the workers in terms of the wage fund? How much is going to go to the landowners? And then how much is left for the capitalists? Like, that's kind of the way they thought, as opposed to, well, marginal productivity says the real wage rate has to be this, and then if there's this many workers, and there were, so this times that must be how much the wages are, and so we take that, that's the way sort of modern neoclassicals think about it. Okay, so again, and this lines up with conventional usage, that you would say, who earns rent? If you're a normal person, you're not a trained economist, you're going to say, oh, landlords earn rent. I got to pay my rent every month to the owner of the property, right? So that's lines up with the classical usage. Who earns wages? Well, labor, and that's true even for economists, but certainly the layperson thinks that. And then what does capital earn? Well, again, in the classical framework, capital earns profit. All right? And profit back then, that meant what was ever left. So there's a certain amount of return revenue the business owner gets from selling products, and then he's got to pay wages to the workers, he's got to pay rent to the landowners and other natural resource owners, if you're going to get more complicated and talk about somebody selling you iron ore or coal or something. And then whatever's left over, well, that's the profit of the capitalist. So in modern times, we also have another distinction between entrepreneurial profit and like a sort of normal interest return on invested capital. So there's that distinction, but back then they weren't necessarily making that distinction. What they meant by profit, we nowadays might just call accounting profit or interest. Okay, now that I've said that to you, let me hit the button on the PowerPoint, and if you don't see it, let me describe it. I have a giant, big, fat, red, cross saying this is wrong, going through this thing. All right, so that 3-part classification system is wrong. Well, it's flawed. I mean, wrong. You get tied up into knots. Okay, that's what I mean when I say it's wrong. I mean, you could have a classification framework and definitions, and you could say, well, how definition's a definition. What do you mean it's wrong? I'm just saying this framework, you get all screwed up. You get tied up into knots when you try to apply it in novel settings. So let me just point that out to you. We're going to come back to this. By the time we get to Irving Fisher, I may choose to go over this at that point, but he just has a few neat little examples, thought experiments to show that this distinction or that this framework doesn't make any sense. So let me just give you a quick one. If you, let's say you have $100,000 in cash, right, and then you go buy a piece of land for $100,000, and then every year you're able to rent that land out to tenant farmers who pay you $10,000 a year. Okay? So that $10,000 that you're earning annually, what is it? Well, you probably would say, well, it's got to be rent, right? Because, you know, I'm renting land, the use of my land, my farmland to tenant farmers, and they're paying me $10,000 a year, so clearly that's got to be rent. But wait a minute. I started out with $100,000 in money, in cash. And then I invested it in something, in an asset, happened to be real estate, and I'm earning a perpetual flow of $10,000 on that. So I'm earning a perpetual 10% return on my initial financial capital. So isn't that flow interest, a return on my capital? So you see the problem. So it's actually both. But the classical framework, you know, was thinking of it as, no, the landowners are different people from the capitalists. So the modern framework, using subjective value theory and marginal productivity theory, and the way we use interest to discount future rents and so on, we're going to talk in great detail about that, starting at least with Bumbaverk and then Frank Fetter and Irving Fisher, and we will go over that. So that's kind of my specialty. So don't worry, folks. We're gonna keep doing that until you're probably gonna wish we'd stop. But I'm just alerting you to the fact that this classical framework, even though it accords with modern usage, at least in the English language, in terms of landowners earn rent, workers earn wages, and capitalists earn profit or interest, that leads you into trouble. And that's really not the way you should think about it. Okay. This mechanism, or this tendency to have falling profit over time. So let me just end this particular lecture with the Ricardian system and the Ricardian model, and how is it that we derive this result that over time, left to its own devices, a static framework, you would expect that the capitalists are going to get a smaller and smaller cut of the total economic output, right? So that's the idea. Again, I've said it before, but let me say it again. In the Ricardian system, it's a very simplistic model. It's like the whole economy is just one giant farm that's just producing corn, and then every period we figure out how much total corn is produced, and then we wonder what governs the distribution of that corn. And there's only three factors. It's the workers, the capitalists, and the landowners. And so the question is, of that total output of corn, how much, what's the share that goes to each of those three groups? Okay, so one of the assumptions is that the unskilled labor is all uniform, right? So it's not like there's different types of workers and some have more skills than others. Ricardo just assumes they're all the same. And he's got the Malthusian notion of, population growing until the point at which the workers earn the subsistence level. Okay, so in long-run equilibrium, it's got to be the case. If there was a period where the workers were earning more, if the real wage rate was more than the subsistence level, well, then there would be more babies born. Okay, and so the idea is that just to kind of simplify things and to pin down one of the variables, Ricardo would say, okay, the money price of corn has to be such, or has to be equal to the money wage rate. Right, because a worker who works for a year has to earn money wages such that he can then go to the market and with that money be able to buy corn, enough corn so he can live and support himself for a year. That's got to be the case. Now, over time, as the population grows, what's going to happen? Well, more and more land is going to be brought into cultivation. But the problem is, at any given time, all the best parcels of land would have been first brought into cultivation. And so if you're saying now the population's growing and they're bringing more and more land into cultivation so that the total output of corn can go up, right? Because that has to be the case, right? If there's more workers total, if the population's growing, well, the total amount of corn that's produced has to grow also if each worker is just getting the subsistence amount. And so the only way that's possible is that more and more land is being brought into cultivation. At any given time, some land is marginal, and then some is submarginal, and some is inframarginal. All right? And so two things are going on there. Number one, as inferior parcels of land are brought under cultivation, that means to raise a given amount of corn from them, you need more workers. Or saying it the other way, for a given amount of workers per acre, you're going to get fewer bushels of corn on an inferior parcel of land. And so what that means is the total amount of labor hours necessary to produce or to yield that marginal bushel of corn is going to go up. So that means the money price of corn is going to go up because it's more expensive to produce it. But money wages go up too because the workers all have to still be able to afford enough corn to eat, to live. All right. And then the other thing going on is the rents to the landowners as a class are going to go up, the total amount of rents, because as more and more land is brought into cultivation on the margin, that marginal piece of land that's just worthwhile to bring into cultivation, that's much less fertile than all the other parcels that had been brought into cultivation earlier. And so you have like a spectrum of farmland going from the most fertile, the most productive, down to the marginal plot of land that at any given moment is the one that's just worthwhile bringing into cultivation. And so rent in the Ricardian system is that differential, right? So the landowners are earning rent. Somebody who has really productive land who can generate twice as many bushels of corn per acre for a given number of workers compared to the one that's now brought into cultivation, that landowner is going to get that return, right? Because competition, he's in competition with the other landowners, if you will. And so, or I should say the workers and the capitalists are in competition too, bidding on the prices of the land. So they would be willing to pay, to give that surplus corn to the landowner. He would be able to demand that because he would say, hey, you're farming over there on that really infertile piece of land. My land shoots out a lot more corn, and so I'm going to say for you to come onto my land and use it and till it and so forth this year, I'm going to charge you a much higher price. So the point is, over time, as they bring in more and more infertile pieces of land into cultivation, the advantage to the original landowners keeps getting greater and greater, and so they get more and more of the output. So you put all that together, out of the aggregate output, if I'm telling you now a growing amount goes to the workers and the landowners, then that means a shrinking amount has to go to the capitalists. And so again, now that I've walked you through that, let me again reread Rothbard's reaction to that. He says, in the mill Ricardian system, wages are fixed by the price of corn or the cost of food. The cost of food, for its part, is always increasing because of the fixed supply of land and the alleged Malthusian necessity to move to ever less productive land as the population increases and presses on the food supply. Thus, rents are always slowly but inexorably increasing, and money wage rates are always rising in order to maintain the real wage at subsistence level. Therefore, hey, presto, aggregate profits must always be falling. All right, so that's what Rothbard was getting at there now that I've explained it in my own words. And so, in summary, the Ricardian system was the first engine. It was the first real model in our modern sense of the term of the economy, which could explain, not just one little thing. Like Hume could talk about, oh, what would happen if the money supply doubled? Oh, I can walk you through there, but that wouldn't talk to, that wouldn't tell you anything about the return to workers or something, and what their what share of the distribution was, or their share of the output was. Whereas Ricardo really had a model that you could solve. You walk through the implications and figure out everything, the equilibrium long run condition, and then you could ask questions like, well, gee, okay, what would happen? We've got this initial situation. Now what would happen if there's a discovery of more fertile land? And then you could go ahead and walk through that and so on. Last thing I'll say here is, let me just connect this to the debate on trade. So that Ricardo is famous for being a free trader, and in fact his work is credited with being very influential in repealing the so-called corn laws. So how does this model of the economy I just walked through, how does that relate to the case for free trade? Well, one way of looking at it is to say, by getting rid of the corn laws, getting rid of trade barriers, getting rid of these barriers to foreign corn coming in, what you were effectively doing was magically giving your people access to better farmland. Right? So the idea is, if we just put an insurmountable wall around England and no foreign corn could come in, well then, as the English population grew and we needed more total corn production, we'd have to just bring into cultivation ever and ever worse pieces of land. But a way to push back that immiserating process, at least temporarily, would be to get rid of those tariff barriers, and now all of a sudden we have access through trade to real estate, to farmland that is far more productive than what on the margin we were using if we were just forced to grow all of our own food domestically. Okay, so that's the connection between this Ricardian model and his famous support and advocacy for free trade. Okay, I will stop there. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you next time.